Along the same lines as Alan, but in a lot less detail here. He obviously thought things were going well for him. He went off to war, he was an early casualty, and the widow was left. Now, she never remarried. She actually survived until 1943. But there was obviously a downturn in her fortunes because she ended up in one of the small cottages in Havelock Street in town. Now, Havelock Street now is a relatively wide street. It's got a club and a chapel on the one side and gardens on the other side. The gardens are built where the cottages stood. They knocked them down so they could widen it from a single lane street into what is now the main thoroughfare from Stow Hill into the town. There were 4 cottages there, and she moved into number 3. I can only surmise, because I've got no evidence, that she was probably forced to take a job and probably worked in retail, because there were really only 2 jobs she could have done. One was as a domestic servant or in a shop. Domestic servants were getting fewer by the 1920s. You know, it was the big upheaval after the war that girls had had a touch of independence during the war because they'd worked in factories, good incomes, they didn't want to be slaves effectively, and also the shop was a slightly more refined job, you know. If one worked in the millinery department or something, one was somebody. Yeah, and you know, I guess that was perhaps partly what was here. But I think the downturn in fortunes as far as the house was concerned probably was just a simple case of money. Interestingly, the family, she and her husband, had come down from Workington in the western side of what was then Cumberland. And the 1939 register, which really doesn't affect our project as far as time is concerned, but is very, very useful when it comes to other things, we couldn't find her in Havelock Street. Numbers 1, 2 and 4 were occupied, but number 3, where she lived, wasn't, or at least it wasn't on the register. So I dug about a bit and found a lady of the same name up in Cumberland on babysitting duties effectively. So my guess is that it was a family relation who'd perhaps been called up, or there was some other reason involved in war work with a young child, and she literally went up there to babysit. By 1943 she was back in Newport. She died in 1943 and left a will. I can tell you no more about the family than that, but the interesting thing about that particular soldier really fits in nicely with what Alan was saying earlier about the fact that they were on the climb. The First World War destroyed all of that, and bang, she was at the bottom of the ladder again. Now contrast that with another soldier who Susie just gave me as one of 2 I asked for a couple of Sundays back, a chap called Charles Abel Furness. Now Charles, when I started digging into his background, found he was illegitimate. He'd been born in Killeen in 1887. We don't know who his father was. I've tried all possible ways of finding out, but the mother was Minnie Furness, who was, I would guess, a servant, and perhaps that's how Charles came onto the earth. But although we don't know, there are certain factors that have popped up later in his life which lead me to believe that it was a wealthy father, and unusually he provided for the baby. Although he probably wanted nothing more to do with it, I think there must have been a settlement. Moving on to 1908, when Charles was 21. His mother, incidentally, had married when he was 11 and died within 18 months. I guess died in childbirth probably. She was only 29 when she died. So of course she was only 16, 17 when she conceived and had him. He was living with his grandparents. Grandfather, John Furness, had been born up in Yorkshire near Sheffield. and was variously described as a colliery timekeeper. He dealt with the men clocking on, clocking off. 10 years later, he's an insurance agent. Then he becomes a temperance missionary. That was when he moved to Newport. Why on earth he should become a temperance missionary, I don't know. But anyway, he did. That didn't last too long. Whether the shock of a daughter having a legitimate child sort of took him to the bottle, I don't know. That may have been a reason. But anyway, he was then a commission agent, which could have been in insurance or it could have been anything similar. So he was obviously sort of slightly well-to-do, shall we say. He had a profession rather than a manual job. All of which does bear relevance later on, because Charles was living with his grandparents after the death of his mother. He marries in 1908, and this is a very interesting part. He and his wife moved into Dudley Street, but they didn't rent the house, and it must have been the only house this side of, well, I would say the top end of Corporation Road that wasn't rented. They bought it. They bought it on a mortgage. A small mortgage it must have been. But this is why I think that the father must have been somebody well-to-do and made a settlement on him. Because he got married at 21, which is when the settlement would have paid up. He would have had a good capital sum to invest in a house. The widow died in 1951, never remarried, and she lived in the same house right the way through. She didn't have to climb back down the social ladder. Now, how do I find out all of this? Well, I did the obvious. I used my family history tracing skills to get the bare bones. But I then had an inspiration. I thought, hang on, what's the most interesting thing about this story? Well, the most interesting thing, which I haven't yet told you, is the fact that when he died in the First World War, he left a daughter at the age of about 5 and twin sons who had been born in June 1914, just before the start of the war. What happened to this lot? Well, one of the twin boys went on to have a son who lives in Cyril Street in Newport. Right opposite some friends of mine who go to the same church. So on the Sunday I said, tell me about this family that lives just opposite you. Oh, they're very nice, sociable people, they said. So I said, oh, right, I'll go and knock on their door and ask them then. So that's all I did. I just went down after tea on the Tuesday, knocked on the door and explained the project. I didn't really have to present too many credentials because he got a copy of the centenary book. I've got your photograph in the back of a book, he said. So that was my in. Anyway, my friends were quite right. They're a very sociable couple. I was invited in, sat down and we got talking. And after about 10 minutes, he said, hang on a minute, he said. He disappears into the back room. So I thought, well, what's he going to do? Produce some papers or what? No, I heard him on the phone. Comes back, he said, right, come in here, he said. My sister is on holiday in Mexico at the moment. We've got her on Skype. Come and talk to her. Now, the sister was in Mexico with her daughter, who apparently is the family historian. She collects everything in, she collects the photographs and everything else. So she was out in Mexico as well. The daughter, the niece of the man I was visiting, actually lives in Finland. So here I'm talking to somebody who lives in Finland, was on holiday in Mexico, and I was sat in Cyril Street. Puts it into perspective a bit, doesn't it? Anyway, she's got Charles's medals, she's got things he took with him to the First World War, she's got apparently a host of things. And she's coming to Newport on holiday in June, because she always does come back on her daughter's birthday. I think it is the beginning of June. So we have arranged to meet in June. Unfortunately, of course, here's me raring to go now with all of this, and I've got to wait 3 months, but there we are. I mean, anything worth waiting, you know, if it's worth having, it's worth waiting for, I think. So I got the information about the mortgage and everything from them, but it does actually hang together. You know, as I say, at the age of 21, he would have got a settlement, and with a grandfather who'd been in insurance, that would have helped in terms of, yes. But more than that, what I didn't tell you was that although his mother had died, her sister, Charles's aunt, was actually by that time married to a former bank manager. So really the stage was all set for, you know, good advice, the potential for getting a mortgage, and I think these people must be historical figures, because in 1908 steelworkers did not get mortgages. They did not buy their own house. My father actually bought my grandparents' house in Vivian Road with the money he got when he came back out of the army at the end of the Second World War, because he got like accumulated money for 6 years being abroad. And that was enough to buy the house in Vivian Road. I think it was £218 he paid for it, or something, you know, astronomical. But that wouldn't have been the case 50 years earlier. So two interesting families that have popped up there. And you know, you will get to hear more about them as we develop the story, obviously, particularly the Furness family, I think, rather than the Coyle family, because I haven't traced any living relatives or anything of theirs. That's more of an illustration as to the effect on a family, you know, rather than anything else. What I've also done is made contact with the parish manager for Maindy. Now, at the time, Maindy covered this whole area, and actually from the beginning of May, Maindy is again going to cover all this area ecclesiastically, which is useful. But we've got a complete set of parish registers from 1861. And although they're all deposited in the archives, they've supplied us with photocopies of all of the registers. So we now have a complete set of registers from 1861, which are actually more legible than the originals were. Because, you know, the way they photocopy these days, they enhance as they go along. So I've actually, the first thing I did when I was over on Monday, I was playing for a funeral, so I took the opportunity. I did dive in to see if Charles was married in St John's, and unfortunately he wasn't. So we're going to have to dig about a bit more for that. He could have been married at the register office, we just don't know. But there are steel workers in the register, so you know, we will be able to find things out basically for nothing, instead of having to fork out £9.50 for a certificate if we do find anybody of interest, if it's there. So that was useful. At the same time, the lady who mans the parish office on a Monday morning is an author. She's a rather garrulous lady, but nevertheless, she knows a lot. She's writing a book about Maindy at the moment, and basing it on people's memories of the past. Now, she also has some material. She wasn't more specific, but she does have some material which she thinks is of interest. So we've got a contact there as well. So doesn't seem to be much that I've done in the last 6 weeks, but you know, at least I made a few contacts. The project as well, sort of extending a little bit into the social history of the area. Linda, who isn't here today, she's become quite interested in as well, because she had family living in those particular streets. And we're aiming to look at streets in order. You know, we're not going to duck and dive, but we'll take a street, particularly one that was very heavily populated with Lysaght's employees, and see if we can sort of make any correlations between the families in terms of where they came from, when they came down. You know, we won't know exactly, but we can work out approximately. Whether there was intermarriage between those families. There are all sorts of social aspects of that sort that can be investigated. I mean, it probably won't surprise you to know the last job I did for 7 years was at the statistics office in Newport, and I qualified as a statistical analyst. So whereas 95% of anybody looking at a census will probably look at it and, where's my family? Where did they come from? Who was related to who? If I look at a set of data like that, I tend to look at how everything relates to everything else. So yes, I use it for family history. You know, we couldn't do the job without it. But it's also interesting to look at it from a social aspect, and families that you know nothing about, but nevertheless fit into what you're doing. Now this week, I've undertaken something rather slightly different, but it's something that's raised its head a few times. Did actually when we were doing the centenary book. The men walked down from Wolverhampton with their families. Which route did they take? How did they get here? did they really walk all that way? Well, we've got enough evidence to say that they did, because I mean, so many people have told us that it can't be, you know, just street legend. It's got to be true. And actually, if you think that a rail journey from Wolverhampton to Newport, let's say 100 miles, it must be that by train, I would think. It's in that sort of part. So if we say 108 miles, because we're talking old money now, 108 miles, in those days on the railway would have cost them, at a penny a mile, it would have cost 9 shillings per adult, 4 and 6pence per child. So if you're bringing 2 adults and 4 children, which is more or less about average, you'd have been paying out 36 bob. Now in today's money, what's that, £1.80? Doesn't sound an awful lot, but that would have been a complete week's wage, I would guess, at that time. So they didn't have much option. I think they had to walk. Simple as that. So I've been looking at the routes they could take. Well, you look at the map and there are probably half a dozen or more routes that are potentially possible. And I don't think for one minute they all took the same route necessarily, because don't forget they were walking down really from 1898. Well, we know through to 1914, because I think Linda's family actually walked down in 1914. So there's a period of at least 16 years when they might have, for all sorts of reasons, varied routes. So how do we go about finding out what evidence is there for whatever route they could have taken? Well, thinking about this, what we have, I've got a map actually, and I've got 2 or 3 potential routes shown on it. And that's based on extracts from the 1911 census. I've not completely finished, well, let's call it Lysaghtland, you know what I mean, the area up as far as Wharf Road and all the streets down to here. I've been through the census for every house for most of those streets. And what I've been looking at is who lives in that house, where they came from, and what happened on the way. And there's 1 or 2 interesting things. First family in Vivian Road, born in Brockmore in Staffordshire, and that's between Wolverhampton and Dudley, that sort of area. They had a boarder with them who was born in Cookley in Worcestershire. Right, now Cookley, if they were walking down, they would walk straight past Cookley. Can't you just imagine a head popping out of the door? Oh, where are you off to? Oh, we're down to Newport to get a job. Well, I could do with a job. I'll join you. All right, surmise, but it's the sort of thing that could well happen. The second one, now this is an interesting one, because you emailed me the other day to say you'd heard from somebody in Oxford looking at the family of, what was the name?
Nash.
Nash.
Charles Edwin Nash.
That's right.
Yeah.
I did a bit of poking about and found he'd married an Emma Birch, as I thought, yes. And you confirmed that that was the correct one. Well, as I picked up the email from Susie saying, yes, that's the correct one, he married a Birch, on my screen, my laptop, I had the Birch family of Milner Street. Eldest daughter, Emma. Smack in front of me, because I was extracting it for this very reason. We've had so many coincidences in this, is beyond belief. One interesting thing about Emma, which has nothing to do with what I'm telling you about the walk, is that she was actually employed as a forewoman in the nail factory at the age of 18. That was Healy and Pearts by Somerton Bridge. But this was before the war, this was 1911, and she was employed as a forewoman in the nail factory. So she was an interesting character in her own right. But the most interesting thing about it is that he was a widower, the father. They have Emma, Flora, May, all born in the West Midlands, Walsall, Cannock and Bloxwich. Then comes Gladys, born in Griffithstown. Then Maud, Jabez and Edith, born in Newport. So, why was Gladys born in Griffithstown? Well, I could think of one very good reason. No, I'm not thinking of the steelworks. No, I'm not thinking of that at all. I doubt very much if they were set on coming down to Newport to work in Lysaght's, they would bother to stop off at Griffithstown for the steelworks. But you're right, that's the obvious explanation. There's a more interesting one that springs to my mind. Suppose his wife was pregnant on the way down. Now, it's highly likely, and I'm surprised that not more women seem to be pregnant on the way down, but the children either seem to be born in the West Midlands or Newport, apart from these couple of odd ones. Griffithstown Hospital was, do you remember what it was?
Okay.
Yeah, before what his purpose was. It was the workhouse for Pontypool Union. So, and of course the workhouse had the element of the infirmary, they called it, about it. So if she was giving birth, rather than give birth in the lane, bundle her into the workhouse to give birth there.
That's amazing. I love that.
So I think that's more than likely what happened.
Would you be able to find out from workhouse records?
We could probably find out from a birth certificate, if nothing else. Yeah. Mind, the trouble with birth certificates in those days is they often just gave the place rather than, you know, the address. But it's they could well have, yeah. Next family in Jenkins Street, they have a boarder. They're all born in Wolverhampton. They have a boarder born in Worcester. Now I think that's probably somebody they picked up on the way down, passing through Worcester. The next family in Oakley Street, same sort of thing, two born in Bilston, the last one born in Newport. Harry at age 10, the place of birth is given as Pontypool, which again could easily be Griffithstown and the workhouse. Next family in Oakley Street, they've got two lodgers with them, one born in Worcester. The second one was born in Bilston, as the family was, so obviously he was chummy coming down with them, but you know, they picked the boy up in Worcester on the way. Next one's a bit more difficult to, I think this must have been a birth under the hedge, because they were all born in Smethwick, apart from Charles, age 7, who was born in Killeen. The next one then born in Newport. So coming down, you know, if Pontypool, it's as logical to come through Killeen as it is any other way. Another one in Leonard Street who picked up a wife on the way down in Kidderminster.
Seems logical.
Yes. And the last one is a bit of a mystery. It's a family in Coverack Road, all born in Wolverhampton, apart from their servant. Yeah, a servant, age 17, born in Kidderminster. So again, my guess must be, because the youngest child was 2, so they must have been walking down and picked this girl up in Kidderminster on the way down for whatever reason. Maybe mother was ill. You know, maybe the birth of the last child had really sort of meant that she couldn't look after the family, so they picked this girl up on the way down to look after the kids. I don't know. It's all surmise, but, you know, that's the sort of things I've been looking at to try and pinpoint some roots. And I'll pass this around for you to have a look. I've defined 2 major routes on here. One is what you might call the blue route. There's blue arrows on that road, and the red route that's got red arrows. This is actually a 1950 map, but the roads really didn't alter between the turn of the 20th century and the 50s. It was only afterwards they started building bypasses and motorways. So luckily I've got a 1950 AA atlas and I've copied it out of there. There's a few possible permutations to, you know, to work around, but by and large that takes into account all the evidence we've got. And interestingly, Kidderminster would seem to be the sort of melting pot. If you think back to the Chartist march in 1839, they came down the different valleys, they all assembled at one point and then moved on again. And the Royal Oak at Rogerstone was a key point, wasn't it? And Kidderminster seems to be just that. There's a direct road from Wolverhampton, there's a direct road from Dudley, there's a direct road from Birmingham, and of course all of our places really fall into that triangle, the West Broms, Bilstons and all of those. So, you know, that's what I think is probably happening. I'll pass that round for you all to have a look at.
That's a fascinating way of looking at the information, Stephen.
It's...
Is there any evidence that the company actually funded you doing? My family came down, but there were youngsters. There were a couple of children.
Yes.
They were very young. I've never thought they walked.
Well,
Been of that view.
We've heard it, I mean, we heard it so many times, didn't we, now, Emma, when we were doing the research? We heard that story from almost everybody. I say it could have been just urban myth, but I don't think so. I mean, my one aunt, her grandfather came down, and she was quite adamant that they walked in all the way down from Wolverhampton.
You don't think the company ever...
No, I don't think the company did. No. No, I think it was a question of there's jobs in Newport if you want to get down there. Yes.
I know my mother, my grandfather's family came down from Wolverhampton, and they were very young when some of them, because some were born in Wolverhampton. Some were
Yeah.
And they were young when they were picked up in the census and that in Newport.
Yes.
So they got down.
To walk, I always thought that. There were youngsters who, I can't remember the exact ages, like to tell you, they were 3, 4, 5, and I can't imagine them walking. That's why I felt they came by train. But I didn't know that it was 9 shillings a
Yes.
ticket from Wolves to
Yeah, travel in anywhere up until the First World War, travel was a penny a mile.